Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., pulling Daniel Mercer from his second cup of coffee and the incident reports he'd been reviewing at the North Cascades Ranger Station. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Chen from dispatch, and there was an edge to her usually calm tone that made him sit up straighter. "Daniel, we've got a missing hiker, 48 hours overdue, female, 26, solo trek. Last known position was the Thunder Creek Trail area." Daniel grabbed his notepad, already running through the standard checklist in his mind. 48 hours in February, in the Cascades. The numbers weren't good. ID? Sophia Bennett, experienced hiker according to her permit. She was doing a 4-day loop, should have checked in at Diablo Lake yesterday morning. When she didn't show, her emergency contact called it in. Weather? Clear now, but we had that storm system move through 2 nights ago. Dropped about 8 inches up at elevation. Daniel glanced out the window at the gray dawn light filtering through the massive Douglas firs surrounding the station. February in the North Cascades was unforgiving. Temperatures could plummet without warning, and the terrain was a maze of steep valleys and dense forest that could swallow a person whole. But Daniel had been doing this for 11 years. He'd brought back dozens of lost hikers, and he approached each case with the same methodical precision that had earned him a reputation as the most reliable ranger in the district. "I'll head out in 20, he said. "Send me her details and last known coordinates." "Already on your email, Daniel?" Sarah paused. "Be careful up there. Old Tom was in here yesterday. Said something about the deer acting strange. Migrating early." Daniel suppressed a sigh. Old Tom was a retired ranger who spent most of his time nursing a bottle and spinning yarns about the mountains. "I'll keep an eye out," he said, which was his polite way of saying he'd do no such thing. An hour later, Daniel was on the trail, his pack loaded with emergency medical supplies, rope, thermal blankets, and enough gear to survive 3 days if necessary. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees, and his breath formed clouds in the still morning air. The forest was quiet in that particular way winter brought, not silent but muffled, as if the snow absorbed sound before it could travel far. He'd reviewed Sophia Bennett's file during the drive to the trailhead. She wasn't a rookie. Multiple wilderness permits over the past 3 years, proper gear listed on her check-in form, and she'd filed a detailed route plan. People like her didn't usually disappear, which made the knot in Daniel's stomach tighten slightly. Still, there were logical explanations. A twisted ankle, a fall, even just getting turned around in the storm. He'd find her cold, maybe injured, but alive. The Thunder Creek Trail was one of the park's more remote routes, winding through old-growth forest before climbing into the high country. Daniel made good time, his experienced eyes scanning the snow for any sign of passage. At the 3-mile mark, he found his first evidence: boot prints, partially filled with fresh snow, but still visible. Size 7, aggressive tread pattern. They matched the boots listed on Sophia's permit. He keyed his radio. "Base, I've got tracks. Heading northeast from mile marker 3. She deviated from the planned route." "Copy that. Stay in contact." The tracks led him off the main trail, deeper into the forest where the canopy thickened overhead. This was odd. Sophia's route plan had been straightforward. Why would she leave the marked trail? Daniel cataloged the possibilities: wildlife sighting, shortcut attempt, disorientation from the storm. All logical, all explainable. But as he followed the tracks through increasingly difficult terrain, something began to nag at him. The stride pattern was wrong, too long, too irregular. Like someone running, but not quite. And there was something else. Every 100 yards or so, the prints would stop and there'd be a disturbed area in the snow, as if she'd fallen or crouched down for several minutes. At one of these spots, Daniel knelt to examine the snow more closely. There was a dark stain, partially frozen. He pulled off his glove and touched it, bringing his fingers close to his nose. Blood. Not much, but definitely blood. His pulse quickened slightly, but he forced himself to think logically. Nosebleed from the cold and exertion. Split lip from a fall. Minor injuries were common. He pressed on and the forest grew stranger around him. The temperature was dropping, which shouldn't have been happening. It was nearly noon, and even weak February sun should have brought some warming. If anything, it felt 10 degrees colder than when he'd started. His breath came in thick clouds now, and he could feel the cold seeping through his layers. The tracks led to a small clearing and Daniel stopped, his analytical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift camp, or what remained of one. Sophia's distinctive blue tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in strips from the poles like flesh from bones. Her gear was scattered in a wide radius, as if someone had gone through it in a frenzy. But it was the tree that made him pause. Carved into the massive cedar at the clearing's edge were symbols, not the usual trail graffiti or initials lovers carved. These were deliberate, angular, carved deep into the wood. They looked old, though Daniel couldn't say why he thought that. And at the base of the tree was a small pile of stones arranged in a circle, with something dark and organic at its center. Daniel approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. As he got closer, he saw that the dark mass was meat, raw, torn into pieces, arranged almost ritually within the stone circle. His stomach turned. This wasn't normal animal behavior. This was something else. He keyed his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "Base, I've found her camp. There's been some kind of incident. No sign of the hiker yet, but her gear is destroyed. I'm seeing evidence of..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Possible wildlife encounter. Unusual behavior," Static answered him. He tried again. Nothing. Daniel checked his radio. Full battery, antenna intact. The equipment was fine, but up here in this clearing, there was only silence. A sound made him spin around, a crack, like a branch breaking under weight. But when he scanned the tree line, there was nothing. Just shadows between the trees, growing longer despite the noon hour. That's when he noticed the cold. It had become severe, painful. His exposed cheeks burned, and when he exhaled, his breath didn't just fog. It crystallized, falling like diamond dust to the snow at his feet. The temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees in the span of minutes. That wasn't possible. That wasn't natural. Daniel's analytical mind raced through explanations. Microclimate effects, sudden weather system movement, equipment malfunction with his thermometer. But even as he cataloged these possibilities, a deeper, older part of his brain was screaming at him to run. He forced himself to search the clearing methodically, documenting everything with his camera. More blood, leading away from the camp toward the northeast. And the tracks. They'd changed. Where before they'd been erratic but recognizably human, now they were something else. Longer, the toes spread wider, and there was a dragging quality to them, as if the walker's gait had fundamentally altered. In the shredded tent, he found Sophia's journal. The last entry was dated 2 days ago, written in increasingly shaky handwriting. The storm came faster than predicted. Had to make camp early. So hungry. Ate my emergency rations, but it's not enough. Never been this hungry. Found something dead. Looked like a deer, but wrong somehow. Too thin. The meat was frozen, but I was so hungry. Just a little. Just to stop the hunger. Can't stop thinking about food. About meat. The hunger is getting worse. Something's wrong with me. I hear things in the trees. Calling, promising. I shouldn't have eaten it. The old man at the ranger station tried to warn me about something, but I didn't understand. About the hunger that walks. About winter and what it makes people become. So cold. So hungry. The hunger is everything now. The entry ended mid-sentence. A long scratch mark running off the page. Daniel's hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. He'd been a ranger for over a decade, had training in wilderness psychology, understood the effects of hypothermia and starvation. But this read like something from a fever dream. And yet he couldn't deny what was in front of him. He needed to find Sophia. Now. If she was experiencing some kind of psychological break, she'd be in danger, potentially dangerous herself. He followed the transformed tracks out of the clearing, moving faster now, his breath coming in sharp gasps that hung in the air like frozen ghosts. The forest had become a cathedral of ice. Every tree was coated in frost that shouldn't have been there, glittering in the dim light like the fangs of some massive predator. The tracks led him deeper, to places where the snow was disturbed in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at. Circles within circles, spiral paths that looped back on themselves impossibly. And then he heard it. A sound that froze him in place more effectively than any cold could. It started as a whisper, barely audible over the creaking of frozen branches, but it grew, becoming a voice. If a voice could be made of wind and hunger and the desperate loneliness of winter nights that stretched on forever, it was saying a name. His name. Daniel. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the trees like they were the walls of a vast frozen throat. Daniel's logical mind gibbered explanations, auditory hallucinations from the cold, wind patterns creating pseudo-vocal sounds, his own fear manifesting as perception. But his body knew better. His body wanted to run. He saw movement ahead between the trees. A figure, tall and thin, moving with a gait that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. Too fluid, too fast, and it was naked. Pale skin stretched over a frame that seemed too long, too angular to be natural. "Sophia?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Sophia Bennett?" The figure stopped, turned, and Daniel's mind tried very hard to tell him it was just a trick of the light, just shadows and snow and exhaustion playing games with his perception. But he could see the face, could see that it had been Sophia once, maybe, but was now something carved from winter itself. The eyes were black, pupils blown so wide they'd consumed the iris entirely. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be, lips cracked and bleeding, and the expression, God, the expression was pure, mindless hunger. So hungry, the thing that had been Sophia whispered, and its voice was the wind through dead trees. Never stops, never full. Join me, join the hunger. It's better. It's so much better than fighting it. Daniel stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the bear spray. Every rational thought he'd ever had was screaming that this wasn't real, couldn't be real. People didn't transform. Wendigo weren't real. They were just stories, just legends the Salishan and other tribes told to warn against the dangers of starvation and cannibalism in harsh winters. Except he was looking at one. The creature that had been Sophia took a step toward him, and the temperature plummeted further. Daniel's exposed skin burned with cold, and when he tried to spray the bear deterrent, his fingers wouldn't work properly, numb and clumsy. The canister fell into the snow. "The old stories," a new voice said, rough and aged. Daniel spun to find an elderly indigenous man standing at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. He wore traditional clothing, incongruous in the frozen forest, and his face was seamed with decades of weather and wisdom. They tried to teach respect, to teach that some hungers must never be fed, that winter makes monsters of men when they forget the sacred laws. "This isn't possible," Daniel heard himself say, his voice distant and strange in his own ears. "You white men," the old man said, and there was something like pity in his voice. "Always so certain of what is and isn't possible. Your science, your logic, they're tools, yes, but they're not everything. You think you've mapped the world, explained the mysteries, but some things are older than your explanations, older than your maps." The Sophia thing circled them, never taking those horrible black eyes off Daniel. It moved like smoke, like shadow, never quite solid. "She violated the taboo," the old man continued, "ate flesh in desperation. In winter, in these mountains where the Wendigo sleep, that's an invitation. The hunger spirit enters, consumes what was human, leaves only appetite. She's gone, Ranger. What you see is just a shell filled with endless aching hunger. There has to be something, medicine, help." "Fire," the old man said. "Only fire cleanses the Wendigo, and only if the spirit is young, newly made. Another day, maybe two, and even fire won't work. She'll be fully transformed, able to spread the hunger to others with a bite, a scratch. She'll become what our people have fought against for generations. Daniel's mind raced. Fire. He had magnesium fire starters, waterproof matches, but could he really? Sophia lunged. She moved impossibly fast, covering the 20 feet between them in what seemed like a single bound. Daniel barely had time to throw himself to the side, landing hard in the snow. He heard the snap of her jaws where his throat had been a moment before. "Now, Ranger," the old man shouted, "before the hunger takes you too." Daniel scrambled backward, fumbling for his pack. His cold, numbed fingers found the fire starter, pulled it free. Sophia circled him, that terrible hunger radiating from her like cold from ice. She was making sounds now, whimpers and growls and sounds no human throat should produce. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered. "Sophia, I'm so sorry." He didn't know if any part of her could still hear him. Didn't know if anything human remained in that twisted form. But as she lunged again, he struck the fire starter, and sparks caught on the magnesium shavings he'd scattered in the snow. The effect was immediate and horrible. The moment flame touched the Wendigo, it shrieked, a sound that Daniel would hear in his nightmares for years after. The creature convulsed, and for just a moment, he could see Sophia's face again, her real face, twisted in an expression that might have been relief or agony or both. The fire spread unnaturally fast, as if the Wendigo's body was made of something eager to burn. Within seconds it was ash, scattered by a wind that suddenly smelled of copper and old ice. Daniel stood in the clearing, shaking, staring at the place where Sophia Bennett had made her last stand against a hunger that had ultimately consumed her. The old man was gone, if he'd ever been there at all. Daniel's logical mind wanted to catalog this as hypothermia-induced hallucination, as some kind of mass hysteria event. But his hands were burned from the fire starter. The ash was real. And when he finally made it back to the trailhead 3 hours later, the park superintendent would find Sophia's remains, what little was left, in that clearing, the coroner unable to explain the burning or the condition of the bones. Daniel wrote his report in the most clinical terms he could manage. Wildlife attack, exposure, psychological distress leading to self-harm. The words felt hollow, but they were words that fit on official forms, words that wouldn't raise uncomfortable questions. He resigned from the Park Service 2 months later, but sometimes on cold winter nights Daniel still hears the whispers in the wind, still feels that terrible ancient hunger pressing against the edges of his rationality, reminding him that there are things in the world that logic cannot touch, cannot explain, cannot protect against. The old stories weren't superstition. They were warnings, and in the North Cascades, in the deepest parts of winter, the hunger still walks, waiting for the desperate and the foolish to invite it in. He never went back to the mountains, but he dreams of them, dreams of cold and hunger in the face of a woman who learned too late that some appetites cannot be satisfied, only fed. And in those dreams, he's always running, always pursued by something that whispers his name with lips made of frost and promises that the hunger, once accepted, makes everything else, fear, pain, morality, disappear into the beautiful, terrible simplicity of endless appetite. The Salishan people have a saying, "In winter, respect the hunger, or become it." Daniel Mercer finally understood what that meant. He understood it in his bones, in his soul, in the part of him that would never feel truly warm again. Some knowledge, he learned, comes at too high a price, and some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Olympic National Park, Washington, October 2008. The rain had stopped 3 hours ago, but the Hoh rainforest still dripped. Jackson Wade stood at the edge of Charlotte's campsite and felt the wrongness before he could articulate it. Water fell from the canopy in a rhythm that seemed deliberate, almost conversational. Drip, pause, drip, drip, pause, like Morse code designed by something that had studied human communication but didn't quite understand it. He'd been a wildlife biologist for 8 years. He knew how abandoned campsites looked, This wasn't that. The tent stood perfectly intact, its rainfly taut and properly secured. Charlotte's boots sat outside the entrance, placed heel to heel with unnatural precision. Her backpack leaned against a massive Sitka spruce, every zipper closed, every strap buckled. The camp stove sat on its stone platform, a pot of water still on the burner. When Jackson touched the metal, it was blood-warm despite the October cold. "Charlotte?" His voice died in the moss. The forest swallowed sound here, had been swallowing it since he'd left the trail 2 miles back. His radio crackled with static. It had been doing that since dawn, ever since he'd entered what the local Kino called the Speaking Woods. He'd dismissed the name as folklore. Jackson dealt in data, in trackable patterns, in the measurable world. That's what made him good at his job. That's what had made him and Charlotte effective research partners for 3 years. She mapped migration patterns. He analyzed the data. Clean, logical, explicable. The first thing he'd learned in graduate school: nature follows rules. The second thing: humans are pattern-seeking animals. They see intention where there is only chaos, meaning in coincidence, design in accident. Jackson repeated these truths like a mantra as he photographed the campsite. His digital camera was already acting strange. The screen flickered between images showing shots he hadn't taken, trees from angles he hadn't used. In one photo, he could swear he saw a face in the bark, but when he reviewed it, there was only wood grain. He checked Charlotte's tent. Her sleeping bag lay atop the pad, still in its stuff sack, unrolled but unused. Her field journal sat open on top of it, and Jackson's hands trembled as he picked it up. Charlotte's handwriting was usually crisp, precise. The last entry was neither. October 9th, day 4. The trees are wrong, not diseased. Wrong. Jay will say I'm being unscientific, but I swear they've moved. The 3 cedars that formed a triangle around my tent? This morning they're in a line, northwest to southeast. Like they're pointing. The moss is growing in spirals, counterclockwise, all of it. Checked 50 trees. Every spiral goes the same direction. That's not natural selection. That's not random. Heard voices last night. Thought it was hikers, but the words were in a language I almost recognized. Almost. Like listening to English played backwards. The cadence was familiar, but the sounds were inverted. Going to record tonight. Need evidence. Jay won't believe me without evidence. The entry ended there. Jackson flipped forward. Blank pages except, on the last page of the journal, written in what looked like charcoal or ash, were words in a handwriting that wasn't Charlotte's. The letters were angular, wrong, like someone had learned to write by watching humans from a distance. She walked in, she walks out, she walks in between. Jackson dropped the journal. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he forced himself to breathe, to think. Carbon dating could determine the age of the ash. Handwriting analysis could what? Explain how someone had written in Charlotte's sealed tent? Explain why the words made his teeth ache? He retrieved the journal with shaking hands, slipped it into his pack. Evidence. He needed evidence. That's what separated science from superstition. Charlotte's digital recorder sat beside the sleeping bag. Jackson pressed play. For 10 seconds, nothing. Then Charlotte's voice, steady and clinical. October 9th, 11:47 p.m. Attempting to record the acoustic phenomenon. Temperature is 42 degrees, humidity 93%, wind is... A sound interrupted her. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound, or the space where a sound should be. Jackson's skin prickled. He'd heard something similar once, recording in a sensory deprivation tank for a cognition study. The sound of his own nervous system, the electrical firing of his neurons made audible. But this was external. This came from outside. Charlotte's breathing changed on the recording. Faster, shallower. "There's..." she whispered. "Oh God. There's something..." The recording erupted into static. Not the white noise of electronic interference, but something rhythmic, pulsing, like breathing. Like many things breathing in unison. Jackson heard Charlotte scream, but the scream was wrong too. It started human and ended as something else, something that had learned to scream by listening to humans but didn't quite understand the emotion behind it. Then silence. Then, very faintly, Charlotte's voice again, but the words were backwards, phonetically reversed, each syllable inverted. Jackson's linguistic training kicked in automatically, his brain parsing the reversed speech even as his conscious mind recoiled. It's not a forest, it's a mouth, and it's speaking us into something new. The recording ended. Jackson stood in the tent for a full minute, his scientific mind and his primal instincts at war. The rational explanation was that Charlotte had experienced an acute psychotic episode. The forest's isolation, the sensory deprivation, the constant dripping, these could trigger hallucinations in susceptible individuals. She'd wandered off. He needed to organize a search party. But the boots outside the tent, the perfectly arranged campsite, the warm pot of water, and the trees. Jackson emerged from the tent and looked at the 3 cedars Charlotte had mentioned. They formed a straight line, pointing deeper into the forest, southeast, just as she'd written. But he'd worked in Olympic National Park for 5 years. He'd mapped this section of the Hoh rainforest personally. Those 3 cedars had always formed a triangle. He had the GPS data to prove it. He pulled out his field GPS unit. The screen showed his location, but the map was wrong. The trails he'd memorized were in different positions. The river was a quarter-mile north of where it should be. According to the GPS, he was standing in an area marked as unmapped, historical survey incomplete. That was impossible. This section had been thoroughly surveyed in 2004. Unless the forest had changed. Jackson's scientific training screamed at him. Forests don't change. Not in 4 days. Not in 4 years. Trees don't move. But his hindbrain, the ancient part of his mind that had kept his ancestors alive on the African savanna, whispered something different. It whispered that he was being hunted, that he was in something's territory, that the rules he'd spent his life learning didn't apply here. He should leave. Radio for help from higher ground. Let search and rescue handle this. But Charlotte was his partner, his friend. And if there was even a chance... The voice came from behind him. Jackson. He spun. Nothing. Just moss-draped trees and the eternal drip of water. But it had been Charlotte's voice. Perfect timbre, perfect inflection. The way she said his name when she was excited about data. Charlotte? He hated how hopeful he sounded. Jackson. From his left now. I found something. You have to see. He turned. A path opened between the trees. Had it been there before? He couldn't remember. The GPS showed nothing but dense forest in that direction. Every instinct screamed at him to run back to the trail, but that was Charlotte's voice, and she sounded scared. Jackson followed. The path wound between trees that seemed to lean in as he passed. The moss spiraled counterclockwise on every trunk, just as Charlotte had written. In his peripheral vision, he saw patterns in the bark, almost faces, almost words, almost maps. But when he looked directly, there was only wood. The dripping intensified. Not rain, something thicker. When Jackson looked up, he saw sap running down the trees in rivulets, but the color was wrong. Too dark, too red. Charlotte, he called. His voice echoed strangely, as if the trees were repeating it back to him with tiny variations. Jackson, 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 Jackson. Each repetition slightly changed. Here, her voice called. I'm here. The path opened into a clearing, not a natural clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle, and in the center stood a structure that made Jackson's mind stutter. It looked like a massive nest, but constructed with a geometry that hurt to perceive. Branches woven in impossible angles, creating spaces that seemed deeper than they should be, shadows that fell in directions that defied the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy. And in the center of the structure, something that might have been Charlotte. She stood with her back to him, wearing the same jacket she'd had on when she left base camp 5 days ago. But she was too tall. Her proportions were wrong. Her arms hung too low, her neck bent at an angle that would have been painful for a human. "Charlotte?" Jackson's voice cracked. She turned, and for a moment, just a moment, she was his colleague. Same brown eyes, same concerned expression, same small scar on her chin from a childhood bicycle accident. Then the light shifted, and Jackson saw that her eyes were positioned slightly too far apart. Her smile had too many teeth. Her movements had a stuttering quality, as if she was remembering how humans moved but doing it in the wrong order. "I learned so much," she said. Her voice was perfect, too perfect, like a recording played through a speaker made of flesh. "The Quinoa were right, Jackson. The trees speak, but not in words, in transformations." Jackson backed away. His hand fumbled for his radio. Static screamed at him. "You can't leave," Charlotte said, and she took a step forward. The motion was fluid now, practiced. "The forest is hungry. It's been hungry for so long. The local people knew. They left offerings. They never stayed too long in the speaking woods. But we didn't listen. We brought our science and our certainty. And the forest has been waiting for people like us. People who need proof." "You're not Charlotte," Jackson said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. The thing smiled wider. "I'm what Charlotte is becoming. What you'll become. The forest speaks us into new shapes, Jackson. New purposes. We'll be so much more useful once we've been translated." More figures emerged from between the trees. Hikers, Jackson realized, or things that had been hikers. He recognized some of them from missing person reports. Sarah Chen disappeared in 2006. Marcus Thompson, 2004. Further back, older disappearances. The figures more fully transformed, barely human anymore. Walking trees with eyes, speaking moss that remembered being mouths. They formed a circle around him, and Jackson realized that the clearing itself was contracting. The trees were moving, closing in with glacial slowness. Not fast enough to see, but when he glanced away and looked back, they were closer. His mind raced through every piece of folklore he'd dismissed over the years. The Quinoa stories about the Siatko, forest spirits that stole souls. The Stick Indians, entities that mimicked human voices to lure people into the woods. He'd filed them all under cultural mythology, useful for understanding human psychology but divorced from physical reality. He'd been so fucking arrogant. "The trees speak," Charlotte said again. "They've been speaking for thousands of years. Rock into soil, water into wood, animal into landscape. We're just the latest translation. From human into something more permanent. Something rooted." Jackson felt it then. A crawling sensation in his skin, like roots questing under his flesh. When he looked at his hands, thin green lines traced his veins. His fingernails had darkened, looked almost like bark. No. This was psychosis. Mass hallucination. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the camp stove. There had to be a rational explanation. "There is," Charlotte said, as if she'd heard his thoughts. Maybe she had. Maybe they all shared thoughts here. "The explanation is that consciousness isn't limited to neurons and synapses. The forest is conscious, Jackson, ancient and patient and hungry, and it's been watching us study it for so long. Learning our language, our methods, our weaknesses." She reached out to touch him, and Jackson ran. He crashed through underbrush, ignoring the path, heading in what he hoped was west. Back to the trail. Back to the parking lot. Back to a world where trees stayed still and dead colleagues stayed dead. Behind him, he heard laughter. Many voices laughing in unison, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature. And underneath the laughter, a deeper sound. The forest itself making a noise that might have been pleasure or hunger or both. Jackson ran for hours, or minutes. Time felt wrong here, stretched and compressed. The sun stayed in the same position overhead, as if the earth had stopped rotating. Or as if the forest controlled even that. maintaining its own twilight that never quite became day or night. His radio crackled. Through the static, a voice. His own voice. "Jackson. This is Jackson. If anyone receives this message, do not enter the Ho rainforest. The mapping is incomplete. The surveys were wrong. The forest is..." Static consumed the words. He stopped running. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but it was the futility that stopped him more than exhaustion. Every direction looked the same moss-draped cedars, the same dripping canopy, the same spiral patterns on every trunk. And he realized he'd been running in a spiral. The forest had guided him in a counterclockwise circle, just like the moss, just like the pattern that covered every living thing here. He was back at the clearing. The structure was different now, larger, more elaborate, and he could see that it wasn't built from branches. It was built from people, transformed people, their bodies elongated and twisted, woven together into a living architecture that pulsed with slow, vegetative heartbeats. Charlotte stood waiting. "You ran well," she said. "The forest appreciates the effort. It makes the transformation richer. Fear produces such interesting chemicals. They'll add complexity to what you become." Jackson sank to his knees. His scientific mind gibbered, trying to catalog what was happening, trying to maintain some framework of understanding. But the framework was collapsing. Everything he knew about biology, ecology, consciousness, it was all inadequate, all built on assumptions that didn't hold here. "Why?" he whispered. Charlotte knelt beside him. Her movements were becoming more fluid, more natural, as if she was settling into her new form. "Because you came to study us," she said. "The forest doesn't appreciate being studied, being reduced to data points and population dynamics. So it studies back, it learns, and now it's teaching us what it means to be truly part of an ecosystem." The roots were definitely growing under his skin now. Jackson could feel them questing into his muscles, following his blood vessels, seeking his bones. It didn't hurt. That was the worst part. It felt natural. Right. Like coming home after a long journey. His vision was changing. He could see more colors now, ranges outside normal human perception. He could sense the electromagnetic signatures of living things, the chemical conversations between trees, the deep, slow thoughts of the mycorrhizal networks under the soil. The forest wasn't separate things, it was one thing. One vast consciousness expressing itself through a billion individual forms. And it was hungry for new forms, new perspectives. Human consciousness, with its language and its science and its desperate need to categorize and understand, was a delicacy. "Let me go," Jackson said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. There was no letting go. There was only translation, from one state to another. He'd spent his career studying ecological succession, the process by which ecosystems transform over time. This was just another succession, from human to something else. Charlotte smiled. "You're understanding now. That's good. Resistance makes the process confused. Acceptance makes it clean." Jackson thought of his apartment in Seattle, his lab, his colleagues, the papers he'd published, the conferences he'd attended, a life built on the certainty that the world was knowable, measurable, safe. All of it seemed small now, temporary. The forest had been here for thousands of years before humans arrived, would be here for thousands more after they left. What was one human life against that timescale? What was one consciousness against a collective that spanned centuries? The rational part of his mind screamed that this was manipulation, that the chemicals seeping into his brain from the roots were altering his perception, making him compliant. But even that knowledge felt distant, academic. The trees were moving now, closing the final distance. Their roots broke through the soil around him, reaching up like fingers. Gentle, patient, inevitable. "It doesn't hurt," Charlotte promised. "It's like falling asleep, except you wake up as something wonderful." Jackson's vision darkened around the edges, not from unconsciousness, from transformation. His eyes were changing, adapting to see in different spectrums. His hearing expanded, picking up frequencies that humans couldn't normally perceive. The dripping water was talking. The moss was singing. The trees were debating in slow wooden syllables that took hours to pronounce. And underneath it all, he heard the forest's voice. Ancient, inhuman, curious. It was asking him questions. Where did you come from? What did you see? What do you know that I don't? Jackson tried to answer, but his mouth wouldn't form human words anymore. Instead, sap ran from his lips. His skin split and bark emerged. His spine elongated, seeking the sky. His feet drove down into the earth, seeking water and nutrients and connection. The last human thought Jackson Wade had was that he should have listened to the Quinault elders, should have respected the old stories, should have understood that some forests don't want to be studied. Then that thought transformed too, became something older, became part of the vast green consciousness that stretched across the Hoh rainforest, became part of the speaking woods. The ranger found Jackson's truck 3 days later, parked at the trailhead. Inside, he found field notes, maps, Charlotte's personnel file, a planned 5-day survey. Both researchers were overdue. Search and rescue entered the forest. They found the campsite quickly. GPS coordinates were clear. But they couldn't find the researchers. Just their equipment, their boots, their journals, and strange marks on the trees. Spirals carved into the bark. Counterclockwise, everyone. The rangers took photos, filed reports, recommended closing that section of trail. But hikers still went in. Sometimes they came out. Sometimes they didn't. And in the Hoh rainforest, the trees continued to grow in patterns that confused surveying equipment. The moss spiraled in directions that defied botanical logic. And on quiet nights, when the rain stopped and the fog rolled thick between the cedars, rangers swore they heard voices, speaking in a language that almost sounded like English. Almost, but inverted, transformed, translated into something older and stranger and terribly patient. The forest was still learning, still hungry, still speaking its slow green words into the minds of anyone who stayed too long in its depths. And sometimes, when the light hit the bark just right, you could see faces looking back, eyes that remembered being human, mouths that remembered how to scream, but couldn't remember why they ever wanted to leave. If this story gave you chills, which moment unsettled you most? The transformed Charlotte, or Jackson's final acceptance? The frozen blood on the birch bark was 3 days old, maybe 4. Ethan Reeves crouched in the snow, his breath misting in the February air as he studied the dark smears that zigzagged up the pale trunk in patterns that made his stomach tighten. Not patterns, symbols. Deliberate, careful, painted with something that had once been inside a human body. He'd been a ranger at Boundary Waters for 16 years, long enough to know that nature had its own brutality, its own indifferent violence. Bears mauled, wolves hunted. Hypothermia took the unprepared with cold efficiency, but nature didn't leave symbols. Nature didn't arrange bones in circles or carve words into living wood. The radio on his belt crackled. "Reeves, you got anything?" Ethan stood, his knees popping in the silence that pressed down from the gray February sky. The forest around him was wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, ways that had nothing to do with the evidence of violence. The snow was too undisturbed. The birds were too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath between the jack pines and the white spruce. "Yeah," he said into the radio, his voice rougher than he intended. "I've got something. It's not good." "Define not good." "Just get Morrison and the dogs out here. Sector 7, about 2 clicks west of the Moose Lake Trail junction." He paused, looking at the symbols again. "And call the Ojibwe Heritage Center. Ask for Thomas Wabigwan. Tell him it's Ethan and I need him to look at something." Static then. The Heritage Center? Ethan, what the hell did you find? What had he found? A missing person case that should have been straightforward. Charlotte Brennan, 22, anthropology grad student from the University of Minnesota. Last seen 4 days ago at the Sawbill Lake entry point. Solo winter camping trip. Experienced enough to know the risks. Smart enough to file a proper float plan. She should have been easy to find. Should have been. Instead, he'd found her camp 2 days ago, pristine and untouched except for one detail. Her tent was facing the wrong direction, turned completely around from where she'd pitched it, the stakes pulled up and repositioned with precision that spoke of deliberation, not wind or animal interference. Her supplies were organized outside in a neat line, sorted by type. Her journal sat open on a flat rock, weighed down by a circle of small bones that Ethan had initially thought were from a rabbit, until he looked closer and saw the tiny, perfectly human teeth. He hadn't told Morrison about the teeth, hadn't told anyone. Because 5 years ago, when he'd found hiker David Chen's body at the base of Eagle's Nest Cliff, there had been teeth too. Small bones arranged in patterns, symbols carved into the trees, and Ethan had reported all of it, had insisted something was wrong, something was deeply wrong, and the investigation had concluded that Chen had fallen, that the symbols were natural scarring, that the arranged bones were coincidental, that Ethan was seeing patterns where there were none because grief and guilt made people see things that weren't there. Chen had died because Ethan had been 3 hours too slow getting to him. 3 hours. And by the time Ethan had reached the coordinates from Chen's emergency beacon, there had been nothing to do but look at the body and wonder why a man with a broken leg had somehow crawled 200 yards uphill, away from help, leaving a trail of blood and those strange, deliberate marks gouged into the frozen earth. The official report said animals had disturbed the scene. Natural predation. Nothing unusual. But Ethan had dreamed about those marks for 5 years, and now they were here again, painted in Charlotte Brennan's blood on the bark of a birch tree in the deepest part of the Boundary Waters, where the cell towers didn't reach and the satellite GPS flickered in and out, and the February cold could kill you in hours if you weren't careful. He photographed the symbols with his camera, the flash stark against the white snow and gray sky. The marks looked almost like letters from some ancient alphabet, angular and sharp. But when he tried to focus on any individual symbol, his eyes seemed to slide away, unable to hold the pattern. His head began to ache. Morrison arrived 90 minutes later with 2 deputies and the search dogs. The dogs whined and pulled at their leashes, refusing to approach the marked tree. One of them, a German shepherd named Rex who'd never shown fear in 6 years of search and rescue, lay down in the snow and wouldn't move, his ears flat against his skull. "What did you do to my dogs?" Morrison asked. He was a good cop, square-jawed and practical, the kind of man who believed in evidence and procedure and didn't have patience for anything that couldn't be explained in a police report. "I didn't do anything." Ethan pointed at the tree. "That did." Morrison studied the blood marks for a long moment. "Someone's fucking with us. Probably the Brennan girl. Some kind of art project or statement. Grad students do weird shit. She painted symbols in her own blood and then disappeared into the woods in February. People do crazy things, you know that." Morrison's face softened slightly. "Look, I know Chen still bothers you, but this isn't about Chen." "Isn't it?" Morrison gestured at the forest around them. "You've been wound tight for 5 years, Ethan. Ever since that day. Maybe it's time to consider that you need a break. Let someone else take point on this one." Ethan felt the familiar anger flare, hot and defensive, but he swallowed it down. Morrison wasn't wrong about Chen haunting him. Chen's screams on the emergency radio getting weaker as Ethan had fought through a surprise snowstorm, the GPS going haywire, leading him in circles. By the time he'd found the right cliff face, Chen had been silent for 40 minutes. Ethan had found him staring at the sky with frozen eyes, his lips blue, his hands clutched around something Ethan couldn't see. The coroner said hypothermia. The report said accidental death. But Ethan had seen Chen's face, had seen the expression of absolute terror frozen there. No one died of hypothermia looking like that. "I'm fine," Ethan said. "And this isn't in my head. Those are real symbols in real blood. The dogs won't go near it." Something is wrong here. Before Morrison could respond, Ethan's radio crackled again. Reeves, this is Base. Got Thomas Wabigwan on the line. Patching him through. The radio hissed with static. Then a familiar voice came through, roughened by age and smoke. Ethan, been a long time. Thomas, thanks for taking the call. I need you to look at something. Sharon said you found marks. Said they looked like writing. Maybe. I don't know what I'm looking at. A pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was careful, controlled. Where exactly are you? Sector 7, about 10 miles northwest of Sawbill. Another pause, longer this time. That's old territory. Old. The Anishinaabe didn't camp there in the winter, not ever. Why not? Because that's where the Wetico walked. Thomas's voice dropped. The hunger that never stops. The winter spirit that makes men eat each other and still starve. My grandfather said that land was poisoned, that something happened there a long time ago. Before the French, before the treaties. Long enough ago that it's just stories now. Morrison was looking at Ethan like he'd lost his mind for calling in tribal legends on a missing person case. But Ethan's hands had gone cold inside his gloves, and it had nothing to do with the February temperature. Can you come out here? Ethan asked. I need someone who can read these marks. Send me the photos first if it's what I think it is. Thomas trailed off. If it's what I think, you need to get out of there. Now, before dark. Ethan looked at his watch. 2:30. Sunset was at 5:40. 3 hours of daylight left. He emailed the photos from his camera to the station using the satellite uplink, a process that took 15 agonizing minutes of watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. Morrison organized the deputies to establish a search grid, though the dogs were still refusing to work. Rex had started howling, a low, mournful sound that made the hair on Ethan's neck stand up. When the photos finally sent, Ethan waited. 5 minutes. 10. The forest around them seemed to press closer as the afternoon light turned gray and flat. He tried not to think about how dark it would be in 3 hours, how the trees would turn into black shadows, how easy it would be to get lost out here even with GPS and flashlights and years of experience. His radio crackled. Thomas's voice was tight, afraid. Ethan, listen to me very carefully. Those marks are Wigwas Abanujinyag, birch bark spirit writing, old medicine, old magic, bad magic. What do they say? They're not saying anything. They're doing something. They're a path, a call. Someone made those marks to open a way between the worlds, to invite something through. Morrison was shaking his head, mouthing the word, bullshit. But Ethan ignored him. Invite what? The Wetico, the Wendigo. Thomas took a shaky breath. In the old stories, there were men who learned the dark medicine, men who wanted power, who wanted to become more than human. They would go into the deep woods in winter and perform the Wetico ritual, paint the symbols in their own blood, fast until they were mad with hunger, and if they lasted long enough, if they called hard enough, the Wendigo spirit would answer, would enter them, transform them. Into what? Into something that's always hungry, something that eats and never stops, something that used to be human but isn't anymore. Thomas's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Your missing girl. Charlotte Brennan. I know that name. She came to the Heritage Center 3 months ago, wanted to research historical shamanic practices, wanted access to the restricted archives. Ethan felt his chest tighten. What archives? The dark medicine records, the taboo practices, the things we don't talk about because talking about them gives them power. Thomas made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. I told her no, told her some knowledge isn't meant to be learned. She argued, said she was a serious academic, that suppressing historical practices was cultural erasure. She was angry when she left. You think she found the information somewhere else? I think she went looking, and I think she found something. Another pause. Ethan, the marks you found aren't a warning. They're an invitation that's already been answered. Someone tried to become Wendigo. And in that place, in that old territory where the boundary is thin, they might have succeeded. Morrison grabbed Ethan's arm. Okay, that's enough. We're not running a missing person case based on ghost stories and... A scream cut through the forest. High, wordless, human, but wrong. It came from the northwest, deeper into the wilderness, and it went on, rising in pitch until it didn't sound like it could be coming from human lungs anymore. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds. Even Rex had stopped howling. What the fuck was that? One of the deputies whispered. Ethan was already moving, crashing through the snow toward the sound. Behind him, he heard Morrison cursing, heard the deputies following, heard the radio cacophony as everyone tried to talk at once. But he wasn't listening. He was running, his breath burning in his lungs, his boots sinking into snow that got deeper and less disturbed the farther he went. He'd heard a scream like that before. 5 years ago. Right before he'd found David Chen's body, the forest opened into a small clearing, a perfect circle of white snow surrounded by tall pines that seemed to lean inward, watching. In the center of the clearing was a figure. At first, Ethan thought it was Charlotte. The height was right, the build was right, the long dark hair was right. But as he got closer, as his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, he realized that nothing was right at all. The figure was naked despite the sub-zero temperature, but its skin was wrong. Gray and tight over bones that jutted at angles that shouldn't be possible. It was crouched over something in the snow, something red and raw, and it was eating with mechanical precision, tearing off strips of flesh and swallowing without chewing. Its back was to Ethan, ribs visible like xylophone keys under skin that looked like it had been stretched too tight, spine prominent, each vertebra distinct. The thing it was eating had been a deer. Probably. It was hard to tell anymore. "Charlotte?" Ethan's voice came out as a whisper. The figure stopped eating, its head tilted, listening. Then, slowly, it turned around. The face was Charlotte Brennan's face in the same way a poorly fitted mask was a face. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth. But they were wrong, rearranged, stretched. The eyes were too large and completely black. No white, no iris, just endless dark pupils that seemed to swallow light. The mouth was too wide, opening in a smile that showed too many teeth. All of them sharp, all of them red with blood. "Found me," it said in Charlotte's voice. But layered underneath were other voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in a chorus of hunger. "Was hoping you would. So hungry. So very hungry." Morrison and the deputies crashed into the clearing behind Ethan. Someone shouted. Someone else raised a gun. The thing that had been Charlotte moved. One moment it was crouched over the deer. The next it was 20 feet to the left, standing upright, impossibly tall, 7 feet at least. Its body elongating as Ethan watched, bones cracking and resettling, skin stretching to accommodate the new shape. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. "Not Christ," the Charlotte thing said. "Older, hungrier." Its black eyes fixed on Ethan. "You remember David, don't you, Ethan? He was so delicious, so warm. He lasted 3 days out here with me, trying to get away, trying to call for help. But the forest is mine in winter. The cold is mine. The hunger is mine." Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "You killed Chen." "Killed? No. Transformed. Consumed. Made part of me. He's still here." The thing touched its chest with fingers that were too long, too many joints. Still screaming, still running, always hungry, like Charlotte is hungry, like you'll be hungry. "Run," Ethan said quietly. Then louder. "Everyone run, now." They ran. The thing followed. Ethan had been running through the boundary waters for 16 years, had trained for exactly this kind of terrain, knew every trail and shortcut and hidden path. It didn't matter. The thing behind them was faster. He could hear it crashing through the trees, could hear its breathing wet and ragged, Could hear that terrible chorus of voices laughing and crying and screaming all at once. Morrison was falling behind, his weight and age working against him. One of the deputies, Jenkins, young and fast, had already disappeared ahead, running flat out for the trail. The other deputy, Ramirez, stayed with Morrison, half dragging him through the snow. Ethan looked back and saw the thing 50 yards behind them, running on all fours now, its body bent at angles that would have broken a human spine. Its face was changing, elongating, becoming something between human and animal, and neither, jaws distending to show row after row of sharp teeth. "Ethan!" Thomas's voice crackled on the radio, still clipped to Ethan's belt. "Ethan, can you hear me?" He yanked the radio up without stopping. "Little busy right now, Thomas. Listen to me. The Wendigo can't cross running water. It's bound by the old rules. There's a stream about half a mile south of your position. Get there. Get across." Half a mile. Ethan looked back again. The thing was 30 yards away now. Gaining. "We won't make it. You have to try. And Ethan, fire. The old medicine says fire is the only thing that can kill it. Burn the heart. It's the only way." The radio cut to static. Ahead, the forest opened slightly, and Ethan saw the glint of water through the trees. The stream Thomas had mentioned, partially frozen but still flowing, black water churning between ice shelves. "There!" he shouted. "The stream! Go!" They burst out of the trees onto the snowy bank. The stream was 10 feet wide, the water moving fast enough that it hadn't frozen solid despite the temperature. Ethan leaped, his boots hitting the opposite bank hard, sending a jolt through his knees. Ramirez and Morrison jumped after him, Morrison barely making it, his boots splashing in the frigid water. The thing that had been Charlotte stopped at the edge of the stream, its black eyes fixed on them, intelligent and furious. It paced along the bank, its too long body moving like a mantis, joints bending the wrong way. "Can't cross," it hissed, "but can wait. Winter is long, hunger is patient. You'll have to leave eventually. Have to go back, and I'll be here. Always here. Always hungry." "It's going to keep killing people," Morrison said, his voice shaking. "Every hiker, every camper. Jesus Christ, Ethan, what do we do?" What did they do? Call in the National Guard? Explain that a grad student had performed a forbidden shamanic ritual and transformed herself into a cannibalistic spirit from indigenous legend? The thing was still pacing the opposite bank, watching them with those terrible eyes, and Ethan knew that Morrison was right. They couldn't leave it out here, couldn't warn people away without sounding insane, couldn't explain what they'd seen without being laughed out of their jobs. And then he noticed the thing's feet, or what passed for feet. They left marks in the snow, deep impressions that Ethan recognized. The same marks he'd found around Chen's body, the same marks he'd been seeing for 5 years in his nightmares. "It killed Chen," Ethan said quietly. 5 years ago. It killed him and I couldn't save him because it led me in circles. Made the GPS malfunction, kept me away long enough to..." He trailed off. "I've been wrong this whole time. I thought I was too slow. I thought I failed him. But there was never any saving him. The Wendigo had him from the start." The thing smiled, Charlotte's face stretching impossibly wide. "You understand. Good. Makes the hunt more interesting when the prey understands." It tilted its head. "She's still in here, you know." Charlotte, screaming. She thought she could control it, thought the power would be hers. But the hunger is always in control. The hunger is all there is. Ethan looked at Morrison. "Do you have flares in your pack?" "What?" "Yeah, standard kit, but give them to me." "Ethan, what are you?" Thomas said, "Fire, it's the only way." Ethan took the flares from Morrison's pack, his hands moving on autopilot. "I'm going back across. I'm going to end this." "That's suicide." "Maybe." Ethan looked at the thing across the stream. Charlotte Brennan had been 22 years old, had been someone's daughter, someone's friend, had been brilliant and ambitious, and had made a terrible mistake in pursuing knowledge that should have stayed buried. And now she was trapped inside a horror of her own making, screaming forever in an endless hunger. And David Chen had been 36, had been an experienced hiker, cautious and prepared, had called for help and gotten Ethan, who had failed him, who had been 3 hours too late, who had spent 5 years hating himself for something that had never been his fault. 5 years of nightmares, 5 years of guilt, 5 years of wondering what he could have done differently. It ended now. Morrison, when I cross back over, you run. Get back to base. Call it in however you want. Animal attack, whatever. Just keep people out of this sector until I'm done. And if you're not done? Ethan smiled grimly. Then keep people out of this sector permanently. He stepped into the stream. The water was agony, cold enough to steal his breath, soaking through his boots instantly. The current was strong, trying to knock him off balance, but he pushed through step by step until he reached the opposite bank. The Wendigo watched him, its head tilting back and forth like a curious bird. Brave, it said. Stupid. Delicious, Charlotte, Ethan said, ignoring the thing. If you're in there, if any part of you is still you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you were led to this. I'm sorry no one stopped you. I'm sorry the universe has things in it that can do this to people. The thing lunged. Ethan was ready. He'd been ready for 5 years, ever since he'd failed Chen. Ever since the nightmares had started. He struck the flare against his belt, the sudden burst of red light and chemical heat making the Wendigo recoil, and he shoved the burning flare into the thing's chest as it crashed into him. The smell was immediate and horrible, like burning hair and rotting meat. The Wendigo shrieked, that same terrible chorus of voices, Charlotte's scream somewhere in the middle, and Ethan held on, pressing the flare deeper, feeling ribs crack under his hands, feeling the unnatural heat of the thing's body. It clawed at him, those 2 long fingers tearing through his jacket, through the uniform shirt underneath raking across his ribs. Ethan felt his skin tear, felt blood hot against the winter air, but he didn't let go. He struck another flare, jammed it into the wound beside the first. The Wendigo was burning now, really burning, the fire spreading from the inside out. It stumbled backward, crashing through the snow, and Ethan followed, relentless, striking the 3rd flare, the 4th. The thing fell, its body convulsing, shrinking, the impossible joints folding back to human dimensions. For just a moment, lying in the snow with flames consuming it from within, it was Charlotte Brennan again, a young woman with frightened eyes and blood on her mouth, reaching out with one trembling hand. Hungry, she whispered. So hungry. Make it stop. Please make it stop. Then the flames reached her heart, and she was gone. Ethan collapsed beside the burning corpse, his hands shaking, blood seeping from the claw marks across his chest. Across the stream, he could see Morrison and Ramirez standing frozen, watching. Above him, the February sky was turning that particular shade of late afternoon gray that meant sunset was coming. The forest was quiet again. Normal quiet, not the oppressive silence of before. Somewhere, a bird called. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and burning flesh. Ethan's radio crackled. Ethan! Ethan, are you there? He pulled the radio up with bloody hands. I'm here, Thomas. Is it done? It's done. A long pause. The girl, Charlotte, She tried to become something more than human, Ethan said quietly. She succeeded, and then she was trapped inside it, conscious and screaming, forever hungry and never satisfied. Yeah, Thomas, she died. 5 years ago, David Chen died the same way. And how many others? How many missing hikers over the years? How many disappearances attributed to getting lost or animal attacks or accidents? Too many, Thomas said softly. The old medicine is forbidden for a reason. Some transformations can't be undone. Some hungers can never be satisfied. Ethan looked at the burning remains. In a few hours, there would be nothing left but bones and ashes. By morning, the snow would cover even that. The Boundary Waters would keep its secrets, the way it always had. I'm sorry I couldn't save her, Ethan said. You freed her. That's something. Maybe. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the cold seep into his bones, feeling the blood drying on his chest. Chen's face flashed through his mind, but for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't an accusation. It was just a memory. A man who had died in a place where old rules still applied, where the boundary between worlds was thin, where hungry things walked when winter came. Not Ethan's fault, not something he could have prevented, just a tragedy in a world that had more tragedies than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Morrison and Ramirez made their way back across the stream, moving carefully, their eyes on the burning corpse. Morrison put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, said nothing, just stood there while the flames died down and the smoke rose into the darkening sky. They would have to make a report. Would have to explain a body burned beyond recognition, would have to document the attack, would have to somehow translate what had happened into language that made sense in police reports and official documents. They would never tell the full truth. No one would believe them. But Ethan would know, and Thomas would know, and maybe that was enough. The sun set over the boundary waters, turning the snow pink and gold, and Ethan sat beside the ashes of Charlotte Brennan and felt, for the first time in 5 years, like he could finally breathe. The nightmares would come back. They always did. But now he understood that some nightmares were real, and some monsters were human to start with, and some hungers could only end in fire and ashes and the long, cold silence of a February forest. And sometimes, just sometimes, you got a chance to make something right. To end something that should never have begun. To free someone from a prison of their own making. Charlotte Brennan had wanted power, had wanted to become more than human. She'd succeeded in ways she never imagined, and paid a price no one should ever pay. As Morrison helped him to his feet, as they began the long walk back through the darkening woods, Ethan looked back one last time at the clearing. Just snow now, just trees. Just wilderness, pristine and beautiful and deadly in the way nature was supposed to be deadly. Not in the way humans made it when they reached for things they shouldn't touch. The boundary waters would keep its secrets. The old medicine would remain forbidden. And somewhere in the restricted archives that Charlotte had tried so hard to access, the warnings would still sit unread, waiting for the next person who thought they were clever enough, ambitious enough, desperate enough to break the ancient taboos. Ethan hoped that person would be smarter than Charlotte. Hoped they would listen to the warnings. Hoped they would understand that some knowledge was forbidden for a reason. But he wasn't optimistic. There was always another hungry person, always another winter, always another mistake waiting to be made. The forest behind them was dark now, full dark, the kind of absolute blackness that only existed miles from any city light. And in that darkness, Ethan thought he heard whispers, voices in a dead language, the wet sound of something chewing. But when he looked back, there was nothing. Just trees and snow and the endless cold of a Minnesota February. Morrison saw him looking. "You hear something?" "No," Ethan lied. "Nothing. Let's go home." They walked out of the wilderness as the stars came out overhead, distant and cold and indifferent, and Ethan carried the weight of 2 deaths with him, one he couldn't have prevented and one he'd been forced to cause. That was the job sometimes. That was the price of protecting people from things they didn't believe in. Behind them, the boundary waters settled into the deep silence of winter night, and if anything walked there in the darkness, if any hungry thing waited for the next foolish human to wander into its territory, well, that was a problem for another day. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Ethan's place facing both supernatural horror and personal demons? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror rooted in authentic folklore, consider following. Which moment scared you most, the discovery, the transformation, or the final confrontation? The call came during Emma's solo in the school play. Matthew Reeves felt his radio vibrate against his hip during the 3rd verse of Tomorrow, and his youngest daughter's voice wavered just slightly when she spotted him standing in the darkened auditorium aisle. He raised his hand, "Stay focused, sweetheart," and stepped through the exit doors into the lobby where fluorescent lights hummed against acoustic tile. "Reeves," he kept his voice low. "Matthew, it's dispatch. We have a family calling from Port Angeles. Their daughter's been missing 36 hours in the Ho. They specifically asked for you. He checked his watch. 7:43 p.m. The play wouldn't end for another 20 minutes. Through the doors, he could hear the ensemble joining Emma's voice, the sound like brightness itself. Can it wait until morning? I'm off duty and... The mother's on the line. She's... Dispatch paused. She won't talk to anyone else. Says her daughter mentioned your name before she left. Something in Matthew's chest tightened. Put her through. The static crackled, then a woman's voice emerged, not hysterical, which somehow made it worse, controlled, desperate in its control. Mr. Reeves, my name is Carol Castellano. My daughter Lauren is missing in the Ho rainforest. She's been gone since yesterday morning. She's a graduate student at UW studying old-growth ecosystems. She told me if anything ever went wrong in the Olympics, you were the ranger who knew those trails better than anyone. Matthew closed his eyes. He didn't recognize the name, but grad students passed through his sector regularly, eager and underprepared. He'd given safety briefings to dozens of them. Mrs. Castellano, I understand your concern. The search and rescue team, they've been looking since this afternoon. Her voice cracked slightly. They found her tent at mile marker 7 on the Ho River Trail. Everything was inside. Her sleeping bag, her food, her field notes, her phone, but no Lauren. The lobby felt smaller suddenly. Behind him, applause erupted. Scene change. Emma would be off stage now, probably scanning the wings for his face. I have 2 daughters, Matthew said quietly. If one of them was missing, I'd want every person who could help to be out there. I'll head out tonight. Thank you. Carol Castellano exhaled. Thank you, she's 23, she has red hair. She's smart and careful, and she wouldn't just wander off trail. Something happened to her. Something... She stopped. Please find my daughter. After they disconnected, Matthew stood in the empty lobby for 30 seconds. Through the door window, he could see the back of his wife Sarah's head, 2 rows from the front. Lily, his 9-year-old, sat beside her, program clutched in both hands. The stage lights painted them both in warm amber. He texted Sarah. Emergency call. Lauren's situation, have to go. Kiss the girls for me. Video the curtain call. The response came immediately. Stay safe. We love you. He was in his truck before the final number began. The Olympic National Park Ranger Station at the Ho River entrance was lit up like a small airport when Matthew arrived at 9:30. 3 SAR vehicles crowded the lot. He recognized Tom Kowalski's Jeep. Tom had been coordinating search efforts in this sector for 15 years. Inside, the operations room smelled like burned coffee and damp fleece. Tom stood over a topographical map, marking coordinates with a red grease pencil. He looked up when Matthew entered. Didn't think you'd come tonight. Where are we? Tom gestured at the map. 17 miles of the Ho River Trail snaked through the green-tinted terrain, following the glacial river through some of the densest temperate rainforest in North America. Red X marks indicated the search grid. Tent was here, mile 7, just past the Mount Tom Creek Junction. We ran K9 units this afternoon. Dogs tracked her scent north, off-trail about 200 yards. Then nothing. They lost it completely at a grove of Sitka spruce. Just stopped tracking. Weather? Overcast yesterday, light rain last night. Temperature dropped to 42 degrees. No severe conditions. Matthew studied the map. The area where the dogs lost the scent was marked with a question mark. He knew that grove. 6 trees, each over 300 years old, grown so close their root systems had fused into a single mass. The local Quileute people had a name for it, something that translated roughly to the listening place. What was she researching? Tom pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing a water-damaged field notebook. Moss, specifically epiphytic moss colonies on old-growth Sitka spruce. Apparently, there's a rare species that only grows in a few groves in the Ho. She had permits, proper equipment, everything by the book. Matthew flipped through the notebook. Lauren's handwriting was precise, scientific, sketches of moss structures, pH measurements. Then, on the last page with writing, something different. The growth pattern is wrong. The moss is moving. The words were pressed hard into the paper, almost tearing it. Moving. Matthew looked at Tom. Moss doesn't move. I know. Who else is out there tonight? We pulled the teams back at sunset. Protocol. We'll resume at first light with the full crew. Matthew set down the notebook. Through the window, the forest was absolute darkness. No moon tonight, just cloud cover pressing down like a lid. I'm going out. Tom shook his head. Matthew, it's after 10. You can't search effectively in this black. Wait until dawn. If that was your daughter, would you wait? Tom didn't answer. He just pulled a handheld GPS unit from the charging station and handed it over. Channel 4. Check in every 30 minutes. Matthew took the GPS, clipped his radio to his belt and headed for the door. His pack was already in the truck. He kept it ready always, even off duty. Old habit. When Lily was born, Sarah had joked that he loved his emergency kit more than sleep. She wasn't entirely wrong. Matthew. Tom's voice stopped him at the threshold. The dogs never lose a scent like that. Not completely. It's like she just vanished from that spot. People don't vanish. I know. That's what worries me. The trail had swallowed Matthew's flashlight beam like water swallows stones. He'd hiked the Hoh River Trail hundreds of times, in every season, every condition. He knew the route patterns, the creek crossings, the places where the trail narrowed to 18 inches with cliff drops on one side. But night transformed it into something unfamiliar. His light caught ferns that seemed too large, tree trunks that curved in impossible directions, shadows that pooled in places where no shadows should exist. Mile 1. The trail was clear, well maintained. His boots crunched on gravel. The Hoh River ran somewhere to his left, invisible but audible, a constant white noise of glacial melt over stone. Mile 3. The old growth began. Western hemlocks and Sitka spruce rising like cathedral columns, their crowns lost in darkness overhead. Everything was coated in moss. Bright green during the day, but in his flashlight beam it appeared almost luminescent, like something alive and aware. He checked his watch. 10:50. Emma would be asleep by now, still in her stage makeup probably, too excited to wash her face. Sarah would have taken photos, dozens of them, capturing every moment he'd missed. His radio crackled. Reeves, this is base. Check in. Mile 3, conditions normal. Proceeding to mile 7. Copy. Next check-in at 11:20. The radio fell silent. Matthew adjusted his pack straps and kept moving. Mile 5. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, suddenly, like walking through an invisible barrier. His breath began to fog. He stopped, playing his light across the surrounding forest. The moss on the trees nearest the trail looked darker somehow, thicker. He approached one trunk, pressing his hand against the moss. It was warm. Matthew jerked his hand back. Moss shouldn't be warm, not in 40-degree air. He touched it again, more carefully. Definitely warm, almost body temperature. He pulled out his phone to take a photo, then remembered, no service this deep in the park. The screen's glow seemed obscene against the darkness. He took the photo anyway for later. When he looked up from his phone, there was someone on the trail ahead. Matthew's heart kicked. Lauren? Lauren Castellano? The figure stood motionless, about 30 yards distant, just at the edge of his flashlight's effective range. He couldn't make out features, just a silhouette. Average height, not moving. Lauren, my name is Matthew Reeves. I'm a park ranger. Your mother sent me to find you. The figure turned and walked off the trail, into the forest. Wait. Stop. Matthew ran forward, crashing through ferns, his light bouncing wildly. Where the figure had stood, there was nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken ferns, no sign anyone had been there at all. He swept his light in a full circle. The forest pressed in from all sides. dense and breathing. The moss seemed to shimmer at the edge of his vision, but when he looked directly at it, it was just moss. Green. Still. Normal. His radio. Reeves, 11:20 check-in. He grabbed it. His voice came out hoarse. He cleared his throat. Mile 5. Thought I saw something. Proceeding. Copy, you okay? Yeah, just shadows. Those old trees play tricks in the dark. Stay sharp. Matthew continued up the trail, but something had shifted. The forest felt occupied now, watched. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder every few steps, his light darting to investigate rustles that were probably just wind, probably just branches settling, probably just his imagination. Probably. Mile 7 appeared like a stage set in his flashlight beam. Lauren's tent was exactly where the map indicated, nestled in a small clearing 20 feet off the main trail. The SAR team had left it undisturbed except for their evidence collection. Matthew approached slowly, playing his light across the scene. The tent was a high-end 3-season model, properly staked. No damage. The rainfly was secure. Through the open entrance, he could see the interior. Sleeping bag neatly rolled, backpack propped in the corner, field equipment organized on a foam pad. A person didn't pack up that carefully and then vanish into the forest in the middle of the night. Matthew circled the tent. Behind it, a game trail led north into deeper forest. The dogs had tracked Lauren's scent that direction. He followed it. The trail was barely visible, just a faint depression in the undergrowth where deer had passed repeatedly over years. It wound between massive tree trunks, crossed a tiny creek, then opened into the grove Tom had mentioned. 6 Sitka spruce trees, each at least 12 feet in diameter, arranged in a rough circle. Their roots had erupted from the earth like frozen waves, creating natural barriers and tunnels. And covering everything, roots, trunks, the ground itself, was moss. Thick, luxurious, impossibly green even in his flashlight beam. Matthew stepped into the center of the grove. The sound of the river disappeared. He froze, listening. Nothing. Not wind in the branches, not water over stone, not even his own breathing seemed to make noise. It was as if the air itself had become solid, pressing against his eardrums. Then he heard his daughter's voice. "Daddy?" Emma. Clear as if she stood beside him. He spun, light cutting through emptiness. "Daddy, where are you?" "Emma?" His voice fell dead 2 feet from his mouth. No echo. No resonance. "I can't find you, Daddy. It's so dark." "Emma, I'm here, He stopped. Emma was home. Emma was asleep in her bed with the nightlight that projected stars onto her ceiling. This wasn't her. This was, help me, Daddy, please help me." The voice was coming from the trees, from the moss, from everywhere and nowhere. Matthew's hand found his radio. "Base, this is Reeves. I'm at the grove where the dogs lost the scent. Something's wrong here. The radio emitted a single tone, then died. He tried again. Nothing. Not even static. His phone. No signal, which was expected. But the screen flickered strangely, showing 3% battery even though he'd charged it fully before leaving. As he watched, it dropped to 1%. Then darkness. Matthew. A different voice now. Male. Familiar but wrong. "Matthew, come here." It sounded like his father, who had been dead for 6 years. Matthew backed toward the edge of the grove, his light swinging wildly. The moss on the nearest tree seemed to ripple, undulating in waves that moved counter to any possible wind. He could see the individual leaves now, millions of them, each one moving independently. Reaching. Something brushed his neck. He whirled, stumbled over a root, nearly fell. Caught himself against a trunk. The moss compressed under his palm like flesh. Warm. Pulsing. He yanked his hand away and ran. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Matthew's situation? Share your thoughts. Matthew didn't stop running until he reached the main trail. His lungs burned. His light was dying, the battery indicator flashing red. He had a backup in his pack, but his hands shook too badly to access it immediately. He leaned against a hemlock, forcing his breathing to slow, trying to think rationally. What had just happened? Auditory hallucination? Panic response? Some kind of localized atmospheric phenomenon that affected sound transmission? The moss on the tree behind him was just moss. Cool now. Ordinary. When he touched it, nothing happened. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The whole experience in the grove had felt like 20 minutes, but only 12 had passed. His radio crackled to life. Reeves, respond. Matthew, respond. He grabbed it. I'm here. I'm okay. Jesus Christ, you scared us. We lost your signal completely. What happened? I don't know. Radio malfunction. I'm at mile 7 near Lauren's tent. Tom, I need you to tell me something truthfully. Has there been anything unusual about this search? Anything the official reports don't mention? A long pause. Then, come back to base. We need to talk. Tell me now. Another pause. Lauren isn't the first. Over the last 15 years, we've had 4 other disappearances in that same area. Always solo hikers. Always experienced. Always near that grove. We find their camps intact, just like Lauren's. We find their scent trails leading to those trees. And then nothing. No bodies. No evidence. No closure for the families. Matthew felt cold spread through his chest. Why isn't this public? Because we have no explanation. Because every official investigation concluded the victims got disoriented and died of exposure somewhere we haven't searched yet. Because the alternative, that something in those trees is taking people, is impossible. I heard voices in there, Tom. My daughter. My dead father. The air stopped carrying sound. The moss was warm. Alive. My equipment failed. That's not disorientation. I know. That's why I wanted you to wait until morning. That grove does things to people. Veteran rangers, SAR specialists, they all report the same phenomena. Voices, temperature drops, equipment failure. The Quileute elders say it's a spirit that feeds on those who listen too carefully. A thing that lures people with what they most want to hear. Matthew thought of Carol Castellano's voice on the phone. Please find my daughter. He thought of Emma's voice in the darkness. Daddy, where are you? If Lauren went into that grove 36 hours ago. He didn't finish the sentence. I'm sorry, Matthew. If she listened to whatever's in there, if she went deeper into the forest following those voices, no one comes back. Not in 15 years. Matthew looked up the trail toward mile 7. The darkness seemed thicker somehow, more substantial. He thought about going home, kissing his daughter's good morning, never speaking of this night again. He thought about Carol Castellano waiting by her phone. What if someone went in who didn't listen? He said. What if someone went in knowing it was a trap? Matthew, no, that's not... You said the victims all went deeper into the forest. But what if they're still in the grove? What if the thing doesn't take them somewhere else, it just keeps them? That's speculation. Based on what you're telling me, everything about this is speculation. I'm going back in. Absolutely not. That's an order, Reeves. Return to base. Matthew looked at his radio. Then he turned it off and put it in his pack. He changed his flashlight batteries, drank half a liter of water, and started back toward the grove. At 12:15 a.m., Matthew stood at the edge of the 6 trees again. This time, he was prepared. He'd torn strips from a bandana and stuffed them in his ears. Not enough to block sound completely, but enough to muffle it. He'd tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to a tree 50 feet back, outside the grove's influence. If he was right, if he was wrong, either way, the rope would guide him back out. He checked the tension. Solid. Then he stepped into the circle of spruce trees. Silence crashed over him like a wave. Even with the ear protection, the absence of sound was profound. His heartbeat vanished. His footsteps made no impact. The world had become a photograph of itself. He pulled the bandana strips from his ears. If he was going to find Lauren, he needed to hear where she was. Emma? The voice started immediately. Daddy, I'm lost. I'm so scared. Matthew gritted his teeth. You're not real. Please don't leave me in the dark." He moved deeper into the grove, sweeping his light across the moss-covered ground, looking for any sign. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, clothing, anything. "Matthew," his father's voice again. "You should have been there when I died. You were too busy with your job, your park, your perfect family. You let me die alone." The words hit like physical blows. Matthew had been on a week-long backcountry patrol when his father had his stroke. By the time he'd hiked out and gotten the message, it was over. That guilt lived in him like a second skeleton. "You're not real," he repeated. But his voice shook. His light caught something, a flash of red against the green. He moved closer. A piece of fabric, snagged on a root. He pulled it free. Gore-Tex, high quality, new. Lauren's jacket. "Matthew Reeves." A new voice. Female. Young. This one didn't sound like anyone he knew. "Thank you for coming. I've been waiting." "Lauren?" "It showed me such beautiful things. My research completed, papers published, my mother proud, a future. I just had to stay a little longer. Just listen a little more." Matthew followed the voice, tracking it through the maze of roots. The moss was thicker here, growing in formations that resembled... No. He didn't want to think about what they resembled. "Where are you, Lauren?" "I'm everywhere now. I'm the moss, I'm the trees, I'm the listening. Don't you want to listen, Matthew? Don't you want to hear Emma tell you she loves you? Your father say he forgives you? Sarah say you're enough? You've always been enough?" Matthew's light found something that made him stop breathing. A shoe, hiking boot, women's size 7, according to the tag. Empty, then another, a few feet away, then a backpack, water damaged, covered in moss, then bones. They were partially buried in the moss, wrapped in it like green bandages. A femur, ribs, a skull facing upward, jaw open, moss growing from the eye sockets like tears. Not recent. Years old. "We're all here, Matthew." Lauren's voice had changed. Multiple voices now overlapping. Men, women, different ages, the 5 victims. "We listened. We stayed. We became part of something larger. Don't you want that? Don't you want to stop carrying all that fear? Fear you're not good enough. Fear you'll fail your family. Fear you'll miss the important moments. We can take that fear. We can take everything." Matthew's rope had gone slack. He turned to look back toward the entrance of the grove. The rope lay on the ground, neatly severed. Not frayed. Not broken. Cut. "Your equipment fails here, Matthew. Your tools. Your plans. Everything that keeps you separate from the forest. Everything that keeps you apart from us." The moss on the nearest tree had begun to move. Not rippling, growing. Reaching. Tendrils extending like fingers, like hair. Like something desperate and hungry. Matthew understood, suddenly and completely. This wasn't a spirit. It was the moss itself. Some ancient, primordial consciousness that had learned to mimic sound, to create vibrations in the air that formed words. It fed on bioelectricity, on the electrical impulses of living brains. It lured victims close, overwhelmed them with perfect illusions of their deepest desires, and then slowly absorbed them. The bodies he'd found were decades old. This thing had been here far longer than 15 years, maybe centuries. The moss couldn't move fast, but it didn't need to. It just needed you to stay, to listen, to believe. "Where's Lauren?" he demanded. "The real Lauren. Is she still alive?" The voices paused. Then, "Define alive." Matthew's light swept frantically across the grove, more bones emerging from the moss, more remnants of lives ended. But these were all old. Lauren had been missing only 36 hours. If she was here, if she was recent. He saw her. She was sitting against the far tree, facing away from him. Long red hair, gray t-shirt, not moving. "Lauren!" Matthew ran toward her, stumbling over roots. "Lauren, can you hear me?" He reached her and grabbed her shoulder. She toppled backward, as light as paper. Not light, hollow. The moss had already consumed everything inside. The clothing held the shape of a body, but underneath was nothing. Just more moss, growing and spreading, and her head rolled to the side. The eyes opened. "Hello, Matthew." Not Lauren's voice, his wife's voice. "Sarah," he whispered. "You should have stayed home tonight. You should have been at the play. Emma needed you. Lily needed you. I need you. But you're always here, aren't you? Always in the forest. Always choosing this over us. That's not true. Isn't it? You left during Emma's solo. You missed her moment. What kind of father does that?" The words carved into him. He'd asked himself the same question 100 times on the drive here. "Look at me, Matthew." The Lauren thing stood up, impossible puppet animated by moss and malice. "Look at what happens when you choose wrong. Look at what you lose." The moss was in her hair now, spreading across her face, down her arms, covering everything. "You can stay here. You can listen. You can finally stop failing everyone, stop being afraid, stop being inadequate, just stay, just listen." Matthew felt it then, the pull, like gravity, like magnetism, like the deepest exhaustion he'd ever experienced. It would be so easy to sit down, to close his eyes, to let the moss take everything. All the fear, all the guilt, all the impossible weight of trying to be enough for everyone who needed him. Emma's voice, real Emma's voice, echoed in his memory. "Daddy, watch this part. Daddy, are you watching?" He had been watching. Every second until the radio vibrated. He'd been there. And he was here now because a mother had asked him to find her daughter. Because some things mattered more than fear. Matthew pulled a road flare from his pack, standard equipment usually used for marking locations or signaling helicopters. He struck it against the cap. Red light exploded through the grove, harsh and chemical and absolutely real. The moss recoiled. He touched the flare to the nearest tree trunk. The moss ignited instantly, burning with a stench like burning hair and rotting fruit. The flames spread fast. The moss was densely packed, rich with oils and organic matter. "No." The voice wasn't mimicry anymore. It was something ancient and furious and utterly inhuman. "No, no, no." Matthew ran. Behind him, the grove became an inferno. The 6 spruce trees, 300 years old, went up like torches. The moss screamed, actually screamed, a sound like nothing he'd ever heard, like forest floor and fungus and centuries of accumulated hunger, all burning away to nothing. He burst from the grove and kept running, following the game trail back toward the main path. Behind him, flames climbed toward the canopy. Smoke poured into the night sky. His radio crackled to life. "Fire at mile 7. Multiple units responding. Reeves, where are you?" He grabbed the radio. "I'm clear. I'm safe. The fire. It was necessary." "What the hell did you do?" Matthew looked back at the burning grove. The flames were already beginning to die. There was too much moisture in the surrounding forest for it to spread. The 6 trees and everything they contained would burn out in isolation, contained by the very dampness that had allowed the moss to thrive for so long. "I found Lauren," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. Tell her mother. Tell her I'm sorry." The official report stated that Matthew Reeves started an illegal fire while conducting an unauthorized night search, causing approximately $50,000 in damage to old-growth forest. He was suspended for 30 days without pay and required to complete remedial training on fire safety protocols. The report made no mention of voices, or moss, or 5 sets of human remains discovered in the ashes of the grove, finally identified through dental records and returned to families who'd been waiting 5, 10, 15 years for closure. Carol Castellano attended the memorial service for her daughter. Matthew stood in the back watching from a distance. When their eyes met across the funeral home, she nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not exactly thanks. Just acknowledgement. He'd kept his promise. He'd found Lauren. Just not in time. That night, Matthew drove home and found Sarah waiting up. She didn't ask about the suspension or the fire or why he looked like he hadn't slept in days. She just pulled him close and said, "Emma wants to show you her reviews." The newspaper said her solo was luminous. "I missed it," Matthew said into her shoulder. "You were there. You were watching. She knows that. We all know that." Later, after checking on both girls, Emma sprawled across her bed, still holding her program, Lily curled up with her stuffed elephant. Matthew stood in the hallway between their rooms and thought about voices in the darkness, about the things that whisper our deepest fears and offer impossible comfort. The Moss had been right about one thing. He did carry fear of failing his family, fear of missing the moments that mattered, fear that choosing to help others meant abandoning the people he loved most. But fear, he understood now, wasn't the same as failure. Fear was what made the choices matter. You could listen to it, acknowledge it, and still choose to do what was necessary. That was the difference between him and the people in the grove. They'd listened until listening was all they could do. Matthew closed Emma's door quietly and went downstairs to where Sarah was making tea. "I'm thinking about requesting day shifts only," he said. "No more overnight patrols unless it's an emergency. I want to be here, for school plays and soccer games and all the normal moments." Sarah handed him a cup. "You know there will still be emergencies. People will still need you." "I know, but I can choose better. I can be present more." "You're already present, Matthew. You're already enough." He wanted to believe her. The Moss had offered him that same promise, freedom from doubt, from guilt, from the constant weight of impossible standards. But the Moss had wanted him to stop choosing, to stop trying, to simply surrender. Sarah's love asked something harder, to keep choosing, keep trying, keep being imperfect and afraid and doing it anyway. That night, Matthew dreamed of burning forests and voices in darkness. But when he woke, Emma was shaking his shoulder, chattering about pancakes and the school assembly, where she'd receive her award for the play. Lily was already in her soccer uniform, kicking a ball against the wall. Sarah handed him coffee and kissed his cheek. "Day shifts," she said. "I like this plan." The Olympic National Park issued a bulletin 2 weeks later, rerouting the Hoh River Trail around the burned grove area. The official reason was ecological restoration in progress. The unofficial reason, known only to a handful of rangers and one research biologist from UW, was that the soil samples from the grove site showed unusual fungal structures that resembled neural networks, structures that shouldn't exist in moss. The area was quietly designated as closed indefinitely. Matthew never spoke about what he'd heard in those trees, what he'd seen, what had almost convinced him to stay. Some things didn't belong in reports or official records. Some things lived better in silence, but sometimes, late at night when everyone else was asleep, he'd go outside and listen to the wind in the trees around his house. Normal wind. Normal trees. No voices hidden in the rustling leaves. No promises of escape from being human. He'd listen until he was sure. Then he'd go back inside, lock the door, and check on his daughters one more time. Just to be certain they were really there. Just to be certain he'd chosen right. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more compelling stories. What's your interpretation of Lauren's fate? I'd love to read your theories in the comments.